Every month, she used a menstrual cup during her period. She had been using it for years without a single problem. It was reusable, comfortable, and something millions of women trusted without a second thought. So when she inserted it before leaving for a weekend trip, she expected nothing more than another normal period. But 1 week later, she woke up with what felt like the flu, a fever, body aches, a pounding headache. She thought she just needed to rest. She had no idea that, deep inside her body, invisible bacterial toxins were slipping into her bloodstream, triggering an immune response so violent it would begin attacking her own organs. Within days, her blood pressure crashed, her kidneys began to fail, then her liver, then her lungs. Doctors watched as one healthy organ after another started shutting down, all because of something she had used dozens of times before. How could a simple menstrual cup trigger a medical emergency so severe that it pushed her body toward complete organ failure? This is Hidden Pathogens.
This is Hidden Pathogens.
32-year-old Jacqueline Brooks lived in Connecticut. She worked as a veterinary technician, spending her days caring for injured dogs, frightened cats, and every other animal that came through the clinic doors. Her coworkers knew her as calm under pressure, the kind of person who never panicked. On weekends, Jacqueline had a completely different routine. She loved visiting antique markets in small New England towns, hunting for forgotten treasures that she could restore in her garage. An old lamp, a weathered rocking chair, a dusty vintage mirror. She said every piece deserved a second chance. She treated her health the same way. When she switched to a menstrual cup several years earlier, it seemed like an easy decision. It was reusable, comfortable, environmentally friendly. After a short learning curve, it became part of her monthly routine. For years, she never had a single problem. She cleaned it exactly as the manufacturer recommended, washed her hands before inserting it, and stored it carefully between cycles. To Jacqueline, it was one of the safest products she owned. By the beginning of spring, she had used it dozens of times without a single concern. So when her next period arrived just before a weekend road trip across Connecticut, she didn't think twice. She sterilized the cup the night before, packed an overnight bag, filled a travel mug with coffee, and headed out before sunrise. Jacqueline had barely finished unpacking when she realized her period had started. "I'll be right back," she called, as Marcus and Emily carried the rest of the bags inside. She walked into the cabin's bathroom, took the sterilized menstrual cup from its small travel case, and inserted it. A minute later, she rejoined them as though nothing had happened. The weekend was everything she had hoped for: browsing antique stores, trying homemade pie at roadside diners, laughing with friends as they searched for hidden gems. Nothing felt unusual, nothing felt dangerous. By bedtime, the menstrual cup was the last thing on Jacqueline's mind. If someone had told Jacqueline that the decision she made that Friday morning would leave doctors fighting to keep her organs alive only days later, she would have smiled and kept driving. Because there was no pain, no warning, no sign that anything inside her body had already begun to change. Or had it? Driving home Sunday evening, Jacqueline Brooks noticed something so small that almost anyone would have dismissed it. What was the first warning her body was trying to give her? Friday afternoon, Jacqueline and her two closest friends drove north toward western Massachusetts. The playlist kept changing. Someone complained about Jacqueline's driving. Someone else insisted they had already missed the best antique shop on the route. It was exactly the kind of road trip they had taken together for years. Their first stop was an old textile mill that had been transformed into an antique market. Within seconds, Jacqueline disappeared into the maze of booths. "There she goes," her friend Marcus laughed. "If she's gone longer than 30 minutes, check the furniture section." 20 minutes later, Marcus found her crouched beside an old brass birdcage. "Tell me you're not buying that." Jacqueline looked up. "I'm absolutely buying this. It doesn't even have a door." I can fix that. Marcus shook his head. You've said that about everything you've ever brought home, and I've been right every time. He couldn't argue with that. By sunset, the birdcage was wrapped in a blanket in the back of Jacqueline's SUV, and the three friends were settling into a small rental cabin surrounded by pine trees. They ordered pizza, played cards, laughed until nearly midnight. Then something unusual happened. Jacqueline went to bed first. Marcus noticed immediately. You quitting already? He called. I'm exhausted, she answered with a yawn. That's a first. Normally, Jacqueline was the last one awake. The next morning, she was the last one out of bed. She stood quietly in the kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee she'd poured 5 minutes earlier. You gonna drink that? Her friend Emily asked. Jacqueline looked down as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. Oh, she took one sip. Then slid the mug away. My stomach feels off. Emily shrugged. Too much pizza. Probably. It sounded reasonable. Nobody questioned it. An hour later, they were walking through another antique market when Jacqueline slowed to a stop. You coming? Marcus asked. She blinked twice. The room hadn't spun. It was stranger than that. For a brief moment, it felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Then it was gone. You all right? Yeah. You sure? I think I stood up too fast. Marcus watched her for another second. She smiled. He let it go. The rest of the afternoon, Jacqueline laughed at jokes, bargained with shop owners, and carried the birdcage back to the car herself. To anyone watching, she looked perfectly normal. But Emily noticed something she couldn't explain. Jacqueline wasn't talking as much. Usually, she was the first person to start a conversation. Now she spent long stretches just listening. That evening, everyone ordered dessert except Jacqueline. No thanks, she said. You sure? Marcus asked. You never skip dessert. I'm just not hungry. By Sunday morning, Jacqueline knew something wasn't right. She had barely slept. Every muscle in her body ached. The headache she had blamed on the long drive had grown into a relentless pounding behind her eyes. When Marcus knocked on her bedroom door, she was already awake. You ready for breakfast? Jacqueline hesitated before answering. I don't think I can, Marcus frowned. Still not feeling great? I probably caught whatever's been going around. She forced a smile. Just give me today. I'll be fine tomorrow. It sounded reasonable. Fever, body aches, fatigue. Almost everyone had experienced those symptoms at some point. No one thought they were watching the beginning of a medical emergency. Most of the day passed with Jacqueline wrapped in a blanket on the cabin sofa. Emily brought her water. Marcus checked her temperature. Just over 102 degrees. That's pretty high, he said. It's probably the flu, Jacqueline replied. I just need to sleep. By late afternoon, the fever hadn't broken. Instead, new symptoms appeared. She couldn't keep food down. Even small sips of water made her nauseated. When she stood to walk to the bathroom, the room spun around her. She grabbed the wall before she could fall. Marcus rushed over. Easy. I'm okay. But she wasn't. She was breathing faster now. Her heart seemed to pound, even while she lay completely still. Emily sat beside her. I really think we should leave. Jacqueline closed her eyes. I don't want to ruin everyone's weekend. Marcus looked at Emily. Neither of them cared about the weekend anymore. As the fever climbed higher, Jacqueline stopped thinking about anything except making it through the next hour. She barely ate. She barely drank. Most of the afternoon was spent wrapped in a blanket, drifting between restless sleep and brief moments of wakefulness. Somewhere in the middle of that exhausting day, one small detail never crossed her mind. The menstrual cup was still in place. Within 30 minutes, they were packing the car. The drive home felt much longer than the trip there. Jacqueline barely spoke. She leaned against the passenger window with her eyes closed, shivering despite the warm summer afternoon. Every bump in the road made her headache worse. Several times, Marcus glanced over. You still with me? She answered, with nothing more than a weak nod. By the time they reached her apartment that evening, climbing a single flight of stairs felt like climbing a mountain. Marcus offered to stay. Jacqueline shook her head. I'll call my doctor in the morning. Before leaving, Emily turned back. If your fever gets any worse, go to the hospital. I will. It was a promise Jacqueline intended to keep. But sometime after midnight, she woke with a violent chill. Her clothes were soaked with sweat. Her heart was racing so hard she could hear it in her ears. She tried sitting up. The room lurched sideways. Before she could reach the light switch, her legs gave out beneath her. She hit the floor. Her phone slipped from her hand. For several terrifying seconds, she couldn't gather enough strength to stand. With trembling fingers, she reached for the phone and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring. Jacqueline? Her voice was barely above a whisper. I think something was terribly wrong. 20 minutes later, Marcus burst through her apartment door. One look at Jacqueline told him this wasn't the flu. Her face was pale, her lips were dry. She struggled to focus on him. Without another word, he helped her to the car and drove toward the nearest emergency department. Neither of them realized that the greatest danger wasn't the fever, or the vomiting, or even her falling blood pressure. It was the invisible chain reaction spreading through her bloodstream, a battle that had already begun long before Jacqueline felt the first symptom. So what was happening inside her body that could make a healthy young woman deteriorate this quickly? While Marcus drove Jacqueline toward the emergency department, another battle was already unfolding inside her body. It had started nearly 3 days earlier. On Friday morning, before leaving for the cabin, Jacqueline inserted her menstrual cup. Like millions of women, she expected it to make the weekend easier. She had no reason to believe anything was wrong. At first, nothing was. The cup itself wasn't dangerous. But over the next several days, one small detail changed everything. Throughout the weekend, Jacqueline became so focused on the trip, her growing fever, and simply trying to get through the day, that one important detail never crossed her mind. The menstrual cup was still in place. Inside the vagina, certain bacteria can naturally live on the skin and in the body without causing illness. Most of the time, they exist peacefully. But sometimes, if the conditions are right, a few of those bacteria begin multiplying far more rapidly than they should. As their numbers increased, they started releasing microscopic proteins far more dangerous than the bacteria themselves. Those proteins quietly soaked through the surrounding tissue and slipped into Jacqueline's bloodstream. She couldn't feel it happening. There was no sudden pain, no warning, no alarm. Instead, those proteins traveled silently through her circulation until they reached one of the most powerful defense systems in the human body, her immune system. Normally, the immune system attacks only the specific germs that threaten the body. But these toxins didn't play by the usual rules. Instead of activating a small group of immune cells, they switched on thousands of them at once. Almost instantly, enormous amounts of inflammatory chemicals flooded Jacqueline's bloodstream. But the response was so overwhelming that her own immune system began causing more damage than the bacteria themselves. Her blood vessels started becoming leaky. Fluid escaped into surrounding tissues. Her blood pressure slowly began to fall. Her heart worked harder and faster to keep blood moving. Meanwhile, her kidneys, liver, and other vital organs were receiving less oxygen-rich blood with every passing hour. This wasn't happening because the bacteria were attacking each organ one by one. It was happening because the body's emergency response had spiraled out of control. From the outside, it looked exactly like the flu: a fever, body aches, vomiting, extreme fatigue. Inside Jacqueline's body, a toxin-driven chain reaction was accelerating with every passing hour. By the time she collapsed on her apartment floor, the damage had already spread far beyond the place where it had begun. And unless someone recognized what was happening soon, her immune system would continue attacking her own body long after the original source had been removed. The doctors were about to begin treating Jacqueline. But could they discover the hidden trigger before that invisible chain reaction reached the point of no return? By 7:15 Monday morning, Jacqueline was lying in a hospital bed with an IV running into her arm. The emergency department moved quickly. A nurse checked her temperature, another drew several tubes of blood. An orderly wheeled a portable X-ray machine into the room. "So," Jacqueline asked, forcing a weak smile, "what do you think this is?" The emergency physician glanced up from her chart. "Honestly?" Jacqueline nodded. "So far, it looks like a bad viral illness. The flu? It's possible." That answer brought Jacqueline unexpected relief. The flu was miserable, but people recovered from the flu every day. The nurse adjusted the IV. "You've probably gotten a little dehydrated over the weekend," she said. "Once these fluids get into you, you should start feeling better." For the first time since waking up that morning, Jacqueline felt hopeful. 20 minutes later, her headache wasn't quite as intense. She could think more clearly. The pounding in her muscles had eased. At that exact moment, the monitor beside Jacqueline's bed let out a sharp beep. A nurse looked up, then looked back at the screen. Her blood pressure had fallen again. "That's strange," she murmured. She adjusted the blood pressure cuff, pressed the button once more. The numbers were even lower. The emergency physician returned. "Let's give her another liter of fluids." Everyone assumed dehydration was still the problem. Another bag of fluid was connected. Another 30 minutes passed. Instead of improving, Jacqueline looked worse. Her skin had become unusually pale. She struggled to keep her eyes open. Her heart was racing. The doctor frowned. "This isn't what I expected." Across the room, new laboratory results appeared on the computer. Several values were now abnormal. Not enough to point toward one disease, but enough to tell the physician something wasn't adding up. Her kidneys weren't behaving the way they should. Some markers of inflammation were climbing rapidly. Others suggested her body was under far more stress than a simple viral illness could explain. Then the nurse reached for Jacqueline's wrist. "Can you squeeze my hand?" Jacqueline tried. Her grip was noticeably weaker than it had been less than an hour earlier. The room became quieter. The reassuring conversation stopped. The physician stepped into the hallway, carrying Jacqueline's chart. "We need to broaden the differential," he said. "What are you thinking?" another doctor asked. He looked back through the doorway at Jacqueline. "I don't know yet, but whatever this is, it's moving much faster than the flu." Inside Jacqueline's body, the toxins continued driving her immune system into overdrive. Every minute her blood vessels leaked a little more. Every minute her blood pressure slipped a little lower. Every minute her organs received a little less oxygen. The treatments that usually helped patients with dehydration and viral illnesses were no longer enough. For the first time that morning, the emergency team stopped asking, "How do we make her feel better?" They started asking, "What are we missing?" And the answer was sitting quietly inside Jacqueline's body. Hidden in plain sight. What single question had no one thought to ask her yet? Less than 2 hours after Jacqueline arrived at the emergency department, the atmosphere had changed completely. The reassuring conversations were gone. So were the smiles. The physician who had first suspected the flu was now standing beside Jacqueline's bed, watching her heart rate climb higher with every passing minute. Another bag of IV fluids had nearly finished. Her blood pressure was still falling. "Run another set of vitals," he said quietly. The nurse didn't argue. She had already been watching the monitor. The numbers worried her too. Jacqueline opened her eyes. "They're not sending me home, are they?" The doctor hesitated. "Not today." It wasn't the answer Jacqueline expected. Something had changed. No one had said it out loud, but everyone in the room could feel it. The latest blood tests arrived. The physician studied them in silence. Her kidney function had worsened. Markers suggesting inflammation were climbing rapidly. Her blood wasn't delivering oxygen to her organs as efficiently as it had that morning. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered. A nurse looked over. "What are you thinking?" "I don't know yet, and that's the problem." While the medical team searched for answers, Jacqueline's body continued fighting a battle it could no longer control. Every beat of her heart was an attempt to keep oxygen moving through blood vessels that were becoming leakier by the hour. Her kidneys were beginning to struggle. Her liver was showing the first signs of stress. The damage wasn't happening because bacteria were spreading everywhere. It was happening because her own immune system had become impossible to switch off. By early afternoon, Jacqueline tried sitting up. The room tilted. Black spots crept across her vision. Before she could call for help, she collapsed back onto the bed. The cardiac monitor erupted with rapid beeping. Within seconds, nurses rushed into the room. Blood pressure? 82/48. It was 94 an hour ago. She's crashing. The physician didn't wait. "Call the intensive care unit." The room exploded into motion. One nurse grabbed emergency medications. Another pushed Jacqueline's bed into the hallway. A third called ahead to the ICU. As they hurried through the corridor, Jacqueline reached weakly for the bed rail. She looked at the doctor walking beside her. "Am I going to be okay?" For a brief moment, he didn't answer, because he honestly didn't know. As the elevator doors closed behind them, another specialist was already being paged to the hospital. The emergency team had reached the limits of what they could explain. Now, they needed someone who had seen a case like this before, but would that specialist arrive before Jacqueline's failing organs reached the point of no return? Jacqueline arrived in the intensive care unit just after 3 o'clock that afternoon. By then, 3 different teams had already reviewed her case: the emergency physician, an intensive care specialist, and a hospitalist. Everyone agreed on one thing: she was critically ill. No one agreed on why. More blood tests were ordered. Blood cultures had already been sent to the laboratory. Broad-spectrum antibiotics were started while doctors searched for the source of the infection. Extra IV fluids were carefully balanced with medications to keep her blood pressure from falling even further. Despite everything they were doing, Jacqueline continued getting worse. Her fever climbed higher. Her heart raced faster. The blood pressure medication had to be increased, and new laboratory results suggested that more than one organ was beginning to struggle. Outside the ICU room, the physicians gathered around a computer screen. "We've ruled out influenza," one doctor said. "COVID's negative. No evidence of pneumonia. What about meningitis? No neck stiffness. Food poisoning. Doesn't explain this." One possibility after another was crossed off the list. Yet none of them explained why a healthy 32-year-old woman had deteriorated so violently in less than 24 hours. Just then, another physician walked into the discussion. She was an infectious disease specialist who had been asked to review Jacqueline's case because of how unusually fast everything had progressed. She didn't begin by looking at the monitor. She didn't begin with the laboratory results. Instead, she pulled up a chair beside Jacqueline's bed. "Hi, Jacqueline," she said gently. "I know you're exhausted, but I need to ask you a few questions." Jacqueline gave a weak nod. The doctor started with the basics. "Have you traveled outside the country recently?" "No." "Any camping?" "No." "Any tick bites?" "I don't think so." "Any new medications?" "No." The doctor paused. Most of the obvious possibilities were disappearing. She looked at Jacqueline again. Sometimes the smallest detail solved the biggest mysteries. "Let's go back a few days," she said. "Walk me through your weekend." Jacqueline closed her eyes, trying to remember. The antique markets, the cabin, pizza, my friends. The doctor listened without interrupting. Then Jacqueline stopped talking. "There has to be something else," the doctor said softly. "Anything you haven't mentioned." Jacqueline frowned. "I don't know." Another long silence filled the room. Then, almost as an afterthought, Jacqueline spoke. "I mean, I was on my period." The doctor looked up immediately. Were you using tampons? Jacqueline slowly shook her head. No, a menstrual cup. The room fell silent. For the first time all day, the infectious disease specialist wasn't looking at Jacqueline. She was looking at the clock, mentally calculating how long the cup had been in place. When Jacqueline answered, the doctor's expression changed. She stood up immediately. Excuse me for one moment. She stepped into the hallway where the ICU team was waiting. I think we finally know what we're dealing with. The physician who had admitted Jacqueline looked at her. What did you find? The infectious disease specialist took a slow breath. It all comes down to one question. How long has that menstrual cup been in place? Could the answer to that single question explain why Jacqueline's immune system had spiraled so violently out of control? And was there still enough time to stop it before the damage became permanent? Before we continue, if you're fascinated by real medical mysteries like this, share this video and subscribe to this channel. And if you value these videos, there's a free link in the description and pinned comment that helps support the channel. Even if you've clicked it before, endeavor to click on it again with every new video you watch from this channel. Every bit of click helps us continue researching and telling these stories, and it's completely free. Now, let's continue. The infectious disease specialist returned to Jacqueline's room without wasting another second. She spoke quietly with the ICU physician before turning back to Jacqueline. I need to ask you something very specific. Jacqueline nodded weakly. When was the last time you removed your menstrual cup? Jacqueline stared at the ceiling, trying to remember. I emptied it before we left for the cabin. The doctor waited. And after that? Jacqueline's eyes widened slightly. I don't think... She stopped. The room became silent. I don't think I took it out. The physician looked at the clock again. How many days ago was that? Friday morning. It was now Monday afternoon. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The doctor turned to the ICU team. I need a pelvic examination immediately. Within minutes, the examination confirmed what the physician had feared. The menstrual cup was still in place. It was carefully removed and sent to the microbiology laboratory for culture. The ICU physician looked across the room. Could this really explain everything? The infectious disease specialist nodded. It explains all of it. She gathered the team around Jacqueline's chart. Certain strains of bacteria can live harmlessly on the skin or inside the body without causing problems. But under the right conditions, they can multiply rapidly. As they grow, some produce extremely powerful toxins. Those toxins don't spread because the bacteria invade every organ. They spread because they're carried through the bloodstream. She pointed toward Jacqueline's latest laboratory results. Once enough toxin enters the circulation, the immune system can become massively overactivated. The body begins releasing enormous amounts of inflammatory chemicals. Blood vessels become leaky, blood pressure falls, and organs stop receiving the oxygen they need. The ICU physician slowly nodded. That's exactly what's happening to her. The infectious disease specialist continued. This isn't a problem we solve simply by removing the source. The toxins have already triggered a chain reaction. Even though the menstrual cup is out, her immune system is still fighting a battle that no longer has an off switch. The room fell quiet. Everyone understood what that meant. Removing the source was only the first step. Now came the race to prevent permanent damage. The ICU team immediately adjusted Jacqueline's treatment. Powerful intravenous antibiotics were continued to eliminate the bacteria producing the toxins. Additional medications were started to help suppress further toxin production. Vasopressors continued supporting her blood pressure while carefully controlled fluids helped maintain circulation. Every decision now had one goal: keep enough oxygen reaching her organs until the storm inside her body finally began to settle. Before leaving the room, the infectious disease specialist looked back at Jacqueline. We found the cause. Jacqueline managed the faintest smile. So, I'm going to be okay? The doctor didn't answer immediately. She had learned long ago never to make promises in the intensive care unit. "We know what we're fighting now," she said gently, "and that's something we didn't have this morning." It was the first real piece of hope anyone had felt all day. But outside Jacqueline's room, the latest laboratory report had just finished processing. One number made the ICU physician stop walking. He stared at it for several seconds before turning back toward Jacqueline's room. The diagnosis had finally been uncovered. Unfortunately, it had come just as another complication was beginning. Had they discovered the truth in time to save Jacqueline's organs, or had the most dangerous part of the illness only just begun? The moment the diagnosis became clear, the ICU shifted from searching for answers to fighting the clock. Every minute mattered. The bacteria had been identified as the source. The menstrual cup had been removed. The medications had been started. But none of that could erase the toxins already circulating through Jacqueline's body. The damage they had triggered was still unfolding. An ICU nurse hung another bag of intravenous antibiotics. A second medication was started to slow further toxin production. Nearby, another nurse adjusted the infusion pump delivering medication to keep Jacqueline's blood pressure from collapsing. Every treatment had a purpose: kill the bacteria, reduce toxin production, support her circulation, protect her organs. Now they could only wait to see whether her body would respond. Jacqueline drifted in and out of sleep. Each time she opened her eyes, she saw a different face. A nurse checking her pupils, a respiratory therapist adjusting the oxygen tubing beneath her nose, a physician listening carefully to her heart. Someone was always watching. That was both comforting and terrifying. Late that evening, the ICU physician returned with Jacqueline's newest laboratory results. He compared them with the numbers from only a few hours earlier. Some had stopped getting worse, others hadn't. One result caught his attention. Her kidney function had declined again. He read the number twice, then quietly placed the chart on the counter. The kidneys are remarkably resilient, but they depend on one thing above all else: a steady supply of oxygen-rich blood. For hours, Jacqueline's dangerously low blood pressure had been starving them of exactly that. Now the first signs of acute kidney injury were becoming impossible to ignore. The physician called the nephrologist, the kidney specialist. Within minutes, another doctor arrived in the ICU. She reviewed Jacqueline's chart without saying a word. Then she examined Jacqueline herself. "Can you squeeze my fingers?" Jacqueline did, weakly. The nephrologist nodded. "She's still making urine." The ICU physician looked relieved. "So we still have a chance." "We do," the specialist replied. "But the next 12 hours are going to tell us a lot." Together, they adjusted Jacqueline's treatment. More wasn't always better. Too much fluid could overwhelm organs that were already under enormous stress. Too little could leave them starved of blood flow. Every decision had to be made carefully. Every medication had to be balanced against another. There was no room for guesswork. Just after midnight, Jacqueline's blood pressure dipped again. The monitor sounded a familiar alarm. Nurses hurried into the room. The vasopressor medication was increased. Everyone watched the numbers. Slowly, painfully, the pressure began to climb. A collective breath was released. For now, they had avoided another crisis. The ICU physician stepped into the hallway where Marcus and Emily had been waiting for hours. Neither had gone home. Marcus stood the moment he saw the doctor approaching. "How is she?" The physician chose his words carefully. "We know what's causing this." Marcus nodded. "That's good. Right? It's a very important step. But she's still critically ill." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "So she's not out of danger." The doctor shook his head. "Not even close." Behind the ICU doors, the medications were finally beginning to slow the chain reaction that had nearly overwhelmed Jacqueline's body. But slowing it wasn't the same as stopping it. The next sunrise would answer the question every person in the hospital was afraid to ask. Had treatment begun early enough to save her kidneys? Or would Jacqueline wake up to discover that one of her vital organs had already suffered permanent damage? The ICU lights never went completely dark. Even after midnight, nurses moved quietly from room to room, checking medications, adjusting monitors, and watching for the smallest change. For Jacqueline, time had become impossible to follow. She drifted in and out of consciousness, waking only when someone called her name or adjusted another IV line. Each time she opened her eyes, the same question crossed her mind. Am I getting better? No one could answer it yet. Outside her room, the ICU team studied her latest laboratory results. The antibiotics were working. The source of the toxins had been removed, but the inflammatory storm inside Jacqueline's body was slowing far more gradually than anyone wanted. Some organs were beginning to stabilize. One wasn't. Her kidneys. The nephrologist looked at the newest results, then compared them with every test from the past 12 hours. The numbers had changed again, not dramatically, but enough to confirm what she feared. Jacqueline's kidneys were no longer filtering waste as efficiently as they should. The injury had progressed. She looked at the ICU physician. We're not where I wanted her to be. He nodded. What are you thinking? We keep supporting her, and if they continue to worsen. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew what she meant. If her kidneys failed completely, dialysis might become the next battle. Back inside the room, Jacqueline stirred awake. A nurse noticed immediately. Hi, Jacqueline. Jacqueline blinked slowly. My mouth feels so dry. The nurse smiled gently. I know. We're giving your body everything it needs. Jacqueline looked around the room. There were more machines now than she remembered. More wires, more pumps, more alarms. She swallowed. How long have I been here? Just over a day. It felt like weeks. A few hours later, Marcus was finally allowed into the ICU for a brief visit. He stopped beside the bed, unsure what to say. This wasn't the Jacqueline who spent weekends bargaining over antique furniture or laughing over late-night card games. She looked exhausted, fragile, almost unrecognizable. He forced a smile anyway. Hey. Jacqueline opened her eyes. For a second, she looked confused. Then she recognized him. Marcus, you scared us. A faint smile crossed her face. The birdcage. Marcus leaned closer. What about it? I never got to fix the door. Marcus laughed. A laugh that immediately dissolved into tears. You'll fix it. You always do. Jacqueline closed her eyes again. Within seconds, she was asleep. Marcus stood silently beside the bed for another minute before leaving the room. Outside, he wiped his face. The ICU physician happened to walk past. Is she going to recover? The doctor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed Marcus a copy of Jacqueline's latest laboratory summary. You see these numbers? Marcus nodded, even though he didn't understand them. They finally stopped getting worse. Marcus looked up. Is that good? It's the first piece of good news we've had. For the first time since Jacqueline arrived at the hospital, the doctors weren't chasing a condition that was getting worse by the hour. They had finally slowed it down, but slowing the illness wasn't the same as reversing the damage. The toxins had already pushed Jacqueline's kidneys to their limit. Now the question was whether those injured organs could heal, or whether the damage would follow her long after she left the intensive care unit. As the first rays of sunlight slipped through the ICU windows, the nephrologist opened Jacqueline's newest chart. She smiled. Just slightly. One number had finally moved in the right direction. Was this the first sign that Jacqueline's body was beginning to win the fight? Or was it only a brief moment of hope before another setback? 48 hours after Jacqueline arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere inside the ICU felt different. Not relaxed, not celebratory, just quieter. The emergency alarms that had echoed through the unit during her first night had become less frequent. Nurses still checked her every few minutes. Doctors still reviewed her laboratory results several times a day, But for the first time, they weren't expecting disaster every time they walked into her room. They were watching for recovery. Early that morning, the nephrologist walked in carrying Jacqueline's newest lab report. She compared it with yesterday's numbers. Then the ones from the day before. A small smile appeared, not because everything was normal, far from it, but because something important had finally happened. The numbers weren't just holding steady anymore, they were improving. She stepped into the hallway where the ICU physician was finishing another patient review. "You should see this." He took the chart, read it once, then again. "The kidneys are waking up." Those 4 words spread through the ICU faster than any laboratory result. For 2 days, every treatment had been focused on keeping Jacqueline's organs alive long enough to recover. Now they finally had proof that her body was beginning to heal itself. Inside the room, Jacqueline looked more awake than she had since arriving. When the nurse greeted her that morning, she answered without struggling to find the words. "Good morning." It was the strongest her voice had sounded all week. A little later, the respiratory therapist removed the oxygen tubing from beneath her nose. "Let's see how you do on your own." Everyone watched the monitor. Her oxygen level remained steady. The therapist smiled. "Looks good." It was another small victory. By afternoon, Marcus and Emily were allowed to visit together. Emily carefully walked to the bedside, trying not to disturb the maze of IV tubing. "You look a lot better," she said. "I feel less foggy." Jacqueline looked from Marcus to Emily. "I don't remember everything." Marcus smiled. "That's okay. You don't have to." Emily reached into her bag. "I brought you something." She placed a small photograph on the bedside table. It was the picture they had taken at the antique market that Saturday morning. Jacqueline stared at it for several seconds. She smiled. "I can't believe that was only a few days ago." "It feels like another lifetime," Marcus said. For a moment, nobody spoke. They didn't have to. The photograph said everything. Outside the room, the infectious disease specialist met with the ICU physician one final time. "The antibiotics are working." The blood cultures identified the culprit. The physician nodded. "The toxin-producing strain responded exactly the way we'd hoped." "She's incredibly fortunate. Another 12 to 24 hours." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Both doctors knew how differently this story could have ended. Before leaving, the infectious disease specialist stopped beside Jacqueline's bed. "You gave all of us a scare." Jacqueline smiled weakly. "I guess I won't be forgetting this weekend. I don't think any of us will." There was one more hurdle before Jacqueline could leave the intensive care unit. The doctors needed to know whether the damage caused by the inflammatory storm would continue healing, or whether it had left permanent scars that no medicine could erase. Tomorrow's tests would answer that question. And for Jacqueline, those results would determine not just when she could leave the hospital, but how much of her old life she would truly get back. 5 days after Jacqueline was admitted to the intensive care unit, she was no longer surrounded by emergency alarms. The medications keeping her blood pressure stable had been stopped. Her fever was gone. Her oxygen levels had remained normal for more than 24 hours. And every new blood test brought a little more good news. The inflammatory storm that had nearly overwhelmed her body was finally fading. One by one, the tubes and monitors that had become part of her daily life began to disappear. The IV pump was disconnected. The heart monitor came off. Even the bracelet identifying her as an intensive care patient was replaced when she was transferred to a regular hospital room. For the first time in nearly a week, the room was quiet. It should have felt like victory. Instead, Jacqueline felt exhausted. A physical therapist arrived that afternoon with a simple request. "Let's try standing." Jacqueline smiled. "I've done that my whole life." "I know," the therapist said, "but your body hasn't." She swung her legs over the side of the bed, placed both feet on the floor, then pushed herself upright. For 3 seconds, everything seemed normal. Then her knees trembled. Marcus stepped forward instinctively. The therapist gently raised a hand. Let her do it. Jacqueline took one careful step, then another. Each one felt heavier than the last. By the time she reached the doorway, she was breathing harder than she had, after hiking steep trails before the illness. She looked down the hallway. It suddenly seemed impossibly long. I never thought walking would be this hard, she whispered. The therapist smiled kindly. Most people who survive critical illness say the same thing. Recovery, she explained, wasn't measured only by blood tests. It was measured in ordinary moments. Walking to the bathroom without help. Eating a full meal. Sleeping through the night. Remembering conversations. Trusting your own body again. The next morning, the infectious disease specialist visited Jacqueline one final time. She pulled up a chair beside the bed. I promised I'd explain everything once you were feeling stronger. Jacqueline nodded. The doctor carefully walked her through the timeline. How ordinary bacteria had produced dangerous toxins. How those toxins had triggered an overwhelming immune response. How her blood pressure had fallen. How her kidneys had nearly stopped working. Jacqueline listened without interrupting. When the explanation was finished, she asked the question that had been weighing on her ever since she woke up in the ICU. So, was this my fault? The doctor shook her head. No. This was a rare complication. But it reminds us that even products designed to be safe have to be used exactly as directed. She explained the importance of following manufacturer instructions, emptying and cleaning menstrual cups at the recommended intervals, washing hands before insertion and removal, and seeking medical attention immediately if high fever, dizziness, vomiting, rash, or fainting develop while using any internal menstrual product. Jacqueline looked down at her hands. I almost ignored all of it. You weren't alone, the doctor replied. Many people mistake the early symptoms for the flu, and that's exactly why getting help early matters. 2 days later, Jacqueline stood outside the hospital entrance. The summer air felt different. Fresher. Marcus loaded her overnight bag into the car. Emily wrapped her in a careful hug. No one rushed to leave. For a few quiet moments, they simply stood there together. A week earlier, none of them knew whether Jacqueline would ever walk out of that building. Now she was going home. But one final appointment still lay ahead. The doctors wanted to know whether her kidneys and the rest of her body would make a full recovery or whether this single forgotten detail would leave a permanent mark on the rest of her life. 3 months later, the brass birdcage sat on Jacqueline's workbench exactly where she had left it. The tiny latch still leaned slightly to one side. The brass bars still needed polishing. For weeks after leaving the hospital, she hadn't touched it. Some days she was too tired. Other days, simply walking around the house felt like enough of an accomplishment. But little by little, her strength returned. Follow-up blood tests brought encouraging news. Her kidney function had recovered. Her blood pressure had returned to normal. The doctors found no evidence of permanent organ damage. The inflammatory storm that had nearly taken her life had finally become nothing more than a memory recorded in her medical chart. On a quiet Saturday morning, Jacqueline picked up the small screwdriver she had been using before everything changed. She adjusted the crooked latch. Then she smiled. This is where I stopped. Marcus looked over from the kitchen. And now? She gently opened and closed the tiny brass door. It works, he laughed. I wasn't talking about the birdcage. Jacqueline looked around the room, at the sunlight pouring through the windows, at the coffee growing cold beside her workbench, at the ordinary life she had once taken for granted. I know, she did. A week before she became critically ill, she had been planning road trips, searching for forgotten antiques, and wondering where she would display that little brass birdcage. She had no idea that a rare medical emergency was already beginning inside her body. Like many people, Jacqueline had mistaken the earliest warning signs for something ordinary. A fever, body aches, fatigue, symptoms that looked almost identical to the flu. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't careless. She simply had no reason to believe something so serious could begin so quietly. Her doctors later explained that toxic shock syndrome is rare and that millions of people use menstrual cups safely every year when they follow the manufacturer's instructions for cleaning, emptying, and replacing them. The danger wasn't the menstrual cup itself. The danger was allowing toxin-producing bacteria enough time and the right conditions to trigger a devastating immune response. Because once that chain reaction begins, the illness can progress with frightening speed. Looking back, Jacqueline often thought about one moment. Not the ICU, not the machines, not even the diagnosis. She thought about Saturday afternoon, when she had wrapped herself in a blanket and convinced herself she just needed to sleep. If she had waited another day before going to the hospital, her story might have ended very differently. Today, the restored birdcage hangs in her living room. Most visitors admire it without knowing why it means so much. To them, it's simply a beautiful antique. To Jacqueline, it's a reminder that life can change in ways no one expects, that ordinary symptoms can sometimes hide extraordinary danger. That listening to your body and seeking medical care when something doesn't feel right can save your life. One forgotten detail nearly cost Jacqueline everything. Fortunately, one doctor asked one simple question, and that question gave her the chance to come home. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. These stories take a lot of research to put together. If you'd like to support the channel, you'll find a free link in the description and pinned comment. Checking it out helps support future videos. Even if you've clicked it before, endeavor to click on it again on every new video you watch from this channel. Every click allows us to keep bringing these cases to the channel, and it's completely free. If you learned something from this case, like, share, and subscribe for more real medical stories. And if you chose not to subscribe, leave a comment and tell me what would make these videos better. I read far more comments than you might think. This is Hidden Pathogens. I'll see you in the next diagnosis. Good night.